Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second video of our For Quarantine video lectures. And so today we're going to be talking about interviewing, one of the first styles of research methods that you can use in sociology. Okay, so let me now share the PowerPoint slides. Again, these PowerPoint slides will be up online as well, but you also see them in the back of the video. Okay. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about qualitative interviews. So some of the things we can be talking about today are, types of interviews that you can do, and I'll be focusing, on qualitative interviews as kind of one of the main things. Then we'll talk about types of questions. So when you're doing a qualitative interview, what are you getting at? How do you ask the questions? How do you do it? And then third, kind of a guidelines for a good interview, right? How do you, what's kind of the tips for interviewing somebody? And then lastly, I'm going to describe my own research, watching bad television. That's the article that came out of this research. About when I and a colleague did an interviewing research project in which we asked people about television shows that they thought were as trashy and bad, and asked them, why do you keep watching it if you think it's so bad? Okay, so let's jump right in. So we can first talk about the different types of interviews. And so I'm going to first talk about structured interviewing, and I'm going to talk about this more briefly because it's not actually really part of qualitative interviewing, which is the main thing that we're interested in today. And so it's really to kind of contrast qualitative interviewing with this more structured interviewing style. So what is it though? So structured interviewing is basically the way in which you sit down with a person or over the phone, and you ask your interviewee a list of specific questions. You have what's called a interview schedule, right? And so it's a printed out list of questions, and you basically go through that schedule. You ask the people, the questions, one by one. What do you think about this? What's your views of the president? Do you, on a scale from 1 to 10, what, how strongly do you support the president's policies? Something like that. And so you're basically, as the interviewer, you're following a strict kind of schedule, a strict interview schedule, where you're basically asking all the people that you interview the same set of questions. And so here, really, the idea is to have all the people who are interviewed, all the interviewees, ask the same set of questions, and so that you can kind of compare the answers. Right? Everybody's asked the same questions, and so you can kind of see the differences in their answers. And then it's also really going to take out the role of the interviewer, right? You don't want the interviewer to bias or to influence the answers of the interviewee. And so you basically kind of put the interviewer on a strict schedule, a strict set of questions. And so everybody's asking it in the same way, no matter who the actual interviewer is, right? And so kind of a key part of, of structured interviews is the interview schedule, a formal list of questions. And so what we can see is that, structured interviews is really a part of survey research that we're going to talk about more about next week, right? It's basically essentially the way that you perform a survey, right? You have a structured interview, right? And so the idea here is, instead of just mailing out the questionnaire or the survey to people and having them fill out it themselves, you have somebody come and go through that questionnaire, go through that survey, and kind of basically make it into an interview. And so the question is, why would somebody do this? Why would you not just mail it out or give it to a person and have it, have them do it themselves? Why bother doing an interview? So a couple of things. First, it's to make sure that the person understands the question, right? So interviews surveys and questionnaires are written in a kind of a very clear way, but often people can still not understand what does the question mean. And so basically the reason for the structured interview is to have somebody there to ask the question, and so to ensure that the person is understanding what it is you're asking, right? And so that makes it, clear, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is it makes sure that the person completes the interview, completes the survey, right? So essentially, surveys tend to be boring, right? They tend to be a bit dull, especially after the 30th or 40th question. People tend to kind of get bored and they just start ticking boxes. Like, I don't know, or yes, 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 or no, 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 right? They stop reading the questions, they stop being interested in your survey, and you're really not getting good results. So by having the person being interviewed, by having a live person there kind of engaging in an interview, it makes sure that people don't get complacent. They don't just start ticking boxes, so it kind of keeps them on track. And so this can be done face to face, right? You actually come to a person's house, like what's being done for the census, or it can be done over the phone. Right? You have people call up and say, can I do a survey with you? And you ask them a series of questions. I actually had a job doing this once, and it was interesting. But it did take, you did follow a schedule and did ask the same question over and over and over again. Right. So the first thing, structured interviewing, you're following interview schedule, a formal list of questions, and it's really used as part of survey research. And so what we can see is that structured interviewing is really quantitative, right? It's really about survey research. It's finding, it's about quantitative research, turning all those structured interviews into some form of numerical data, right? So that you can use statistics on them. For the rest of the day, what we really want to focus on is unstructured and semi-structured interviewing. And this is what we can really call, qualitative interviews, sometimes called in-depth interviews, right? And so here, the goal is not to simply get the person to answer a survey, but you really want to know more about what that person thinks, right? And so the two ways to do that are unstructured and semi-structured. So let's jump into that and see how that's different from structured interviewing. So first we have unstructured interviewing, right? So kind of complete contrast to structured interviewing. So the first thing I want to say about unstructured interviewing is that the name is a bit of a misnomer. It's not exactly an accurate name, right? It suggests that it's just a free-for-all or there's no structure to it at all. But that's actually not completely true. In an unstructured interview, you're still interviewing the person. You still have a plan of what you want to ask the person and what you're trying to get at. But really the goal is you are having flexibility. And so the main difference is there is really no schedule of questions. There's no interview schedule. There's no list of questions that you're planning on asking the person. Instead, the interview functions more like a conversation. You have a general topic, you have an idea of what you want to ask the person, but you kind of let the interview go where it goes, right? If a person starts talking about a very specific topic or something that they seem interested in and you think that that's useful, you go that way, right? You don't have to stick to your schedule. You let the interviewee guide what the interview is about. Right? And so really the goal here is to get the person to open up, to express themselves and tell you what they think about the world. An idea is the best way to do that is just kind of let it be a little bit more free flowing, right? So as I said, the goal is to have flexibility and to have in-depth knowledge, right? So to kind of really get to know what the person is thinking. Right, so unstructured interviewing, very open-ended, very flexible, and functioning more like a conversation, but a conversation in which you're trying to get at what the person thinks about the world. It's not about you. It's not about sharing your opinions, but it's about really understanding where that person, is coming from. Next, we have something that kind of sits between structured and unstructured. That is semi-structured interviewing. Right? So, like unstructured, it has that open-ended quality, right? It allows the interview to go in directions that are interesting and fruitful, but it also has a bit of a structure to it to keep you and the interview on path. And so the main idea here is, it's a bit of a balance between the two, right? It's kind of a midway point between structured and unstructured. And the main way that that is achieved is through what's called an interview guide. And so importantly, an interview guide is different from an interview schedule. So an interview schedule is a formal list of questions and you'll ask those questions one by one. Interview guide is it's a series of questions, but they're basically a set of questions to kind of get the interview going and to kind of make sure that you're going to cover topics that you think are important to cover, right? But the big difference is that with an interview guide, you're allowed to deviate. You're allowed to go off and pursue different topics that are not on the guide, or to ask the questions in a different series, right? If the person jumps to a question further down the line, you can, you don't have to do it in the series that it's done. So the guide is more of a general guide, right? It's there to kind of keep the interview on track, there to make sure that you're covering topics that you want to cover, but it's more flexible, right? And so it allows that flexibility of unstructured, but also helps ensure that, that you're covering things you want to cover. So, it is kind of a list of questions. You write the questions out beforehand. But you're allowed to ask the questions in different ways. You're allowed to skip some questions you think that for this person it's not going to be useful. The idea is it's a guide. It doesn't have to be so formal. And so here we have the different types of interviews, right? Structured, really there to perform a survey. Unstructured, very free form, and allows you to really get in-depth knowledge, very flexible. And then semi-structured, that's a midway point between the other two, allowing you to kind of get in-depth knowledge, but also keep the interview on track. And so the rest of today, I'm really talking about, just to be clear, really talking about unstructured and semi-structured. That's what we really think about as qualitative interviewing. Structured interviewing and surveys we'll talk about next week. So now let's talk about your questions, right? You asking questions is the key part to doing an interview, right? You've got somebody to talk to, they're willing to talk to you, you sit down with them, and so now you got to ask them questions. And so what are you going to ask them, right? And so a way to think about it is we can divide up questions into two main groups, what are called content mapping questions, and then content mining questions, sometimes called probes. So content mapping is this kind of the general way that you get the breadth of knowledge, right? The overall or general understanding what the person thinks. And then content mining is where you go more in depth, right? You probe the person, you kind of ask follow-up questions to kind of get more accurate, more in-depth knowledge. So let's go through these two different types of questions, and I'm going to be using the example of, hypothetical example of people who are using drugs and who are addicted to drugs. And we can imagine we're doing an interview research where we're interviewing people who are addicted to drugs. Okay. So first we have content mapping questions, right? So as I said, the goal of these types of questions are to map or cover a broad area that the interview is about, right? Here you want to kind of identify all the issues of the topic and kind of really kind of getting it all down, right? You want to make sure that all the topics that you want to cover are covered that you kind of at least kind of get some of the information out. You're really kind of getting a general sense of what the person thinks. So there's a few ways that this works. So for example, we have ground mapping questions. And so ground mapping questions are really introductory questions, right? Questions that get the interview started, right? Kind of just preliminary questions, questions to get it going and to get the conversation, the interview flowing. Right? So for example, let's imagine we're interviewing somebody about their drug use, right? We can say, okay, when was the last time you used drugs? That's something that's, that they probably can remember, something that they can start talking about. What was it like? Describe that experience. Then we can ask, what kind of drugs do you use? Do you use heroin? Do you use cocaine? Do you use opioids? Right? Kind of get the person going and get a sense of, okay, what kind of drugs is this person, addicted to? Right? So that's first. Ground mapping questions, introductory questions, get the interview started, get a general sense of what the person thinks. Now we can talk about what are called dimension mapping questions. So now that we have a general idea of what the person thinks, now we want to go into a little bit more depth into the different areas or topics that the person has started talking to us about. We can think about this as different dimensions, right? And this goes back to the idea of the dimensions of a concept, right? So for example, we want to talk about a person's feeling of addiction, right? And so we say, oh, really, let's think about addiction now, right? That's one of the dimensions we're interested in, right? So no, tell me, when was the last time you tried to quit? Really kind of getting a little bit more specific there. What was going through your mind? Here we're getting at that psychological aspect of addiction. And then we ask them, oh, what did your body feel like? What was your physical experience? Here we're getting onto that physiological dimension of addiction. And so here we're really trying to map out the different aspects of the topic, right? We had some introductory questions at the start, then we're mapping out now the different topics, the different dimensions that we want to interview the person about. Lastly, we have what are called perspective widening questions. Here, what we want to do is we want to get the person to think about the topic in a different way, right? We want them to kind of see their topic in a different light or a different perspective, right? The person we're interviewing may have only thought about drugs in a certain way. And what we're trying to do is to get them to see it in a different way, to kind of open up and kind of take a different approach. Right. So, for example, we say, what was going on in your life when you first began to use drugs? Right. That might be something that they hadn't thought of before. Right. Did you lose your job? Was there something stressful happening? Here, we're trying to get them to think about things that they might not have thought about before. Right. Where we are widening their perspective. Right. In essence, these are what we can call thought-provoking questions, right? We're widening their perspective, we're provoking them, we're making them think. Right? We have to be a little bit careful when we do this because we don't want to kind of offend or anger the person. We want it, for a good interview, you want to have good feelings, generally good feelings, and so you don't want to make it a hostile interview. And so sometimes these perspective widening questions can trigger a person and make them upset. And that's that's good in a way because it starts them thinking, but then it can be tricky if you're making the person angry or pissed off. Okay, so we got content mapping questions that get at the different aspects of the topic that we're interviewing the person on. Now we have content mining questions. So these are basically what we call probes, right? What we can think of them as follow-up questions, right? So we ask a question, we ask a content mapping question, the person says something, And now we want the person to say more, right? We want to have them to give us more of an answer, right? And so we basically ask a follow-up question to kind of probe them to get them to speak longer. So what's the different ways that this happens? So the first is an amplification probe, right? Basically, this is to just get the person talking more, right? To elaborate, right? So, let's say from the last example, somebody says, their partner broke up with them, and that's when they first started using drugs. And we want to find out more about that. We think that that's important. So we say, oh, well, what was that like? Tell me more about that. And so an amplification probe is really just to get the person talking more. Your goal really here is to get them to say more. And so you're basically asking questions to kind of keep them talking. And so that's what a lot of probes are. It's simply to get the person to keep talking about the topic because you think it's useful. Okay, we have that. Then we also have explanatory probes. Here, these are basically why questions. You're getting the person to explain their beliefs or explain their behavior. You want them to say, why did they do the things that they do, or why do they believe the things that they believe? Right? So they say they can't stop quitting heroin. Why? Ask them. They're right there. Say, okay, well, what do you think's stopping you? Right? And so they, at that point, have to kind of think about themselves, explain themselves, and what they say might actually be, really useful or kind of interesting data, interesting information. Lastly, what we have are clarification probes, right? So here, the person has said something interesting, the person has said something important, but it's not exactly clear what they mean, right? It's, it's a little bit vague or something. And so we want them to clarify. We want them to say, well, what exactly do you mean by what you just said? Right? So let's imagine that somebody says, they're addicted to drugs because it's out of my hands. And we think that's interesting, which I think it sounds interesting. And we say, well, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to you to say it's out of my hands? And again, the person would then clarify. They will elaborate and say, well, this is what I mean by the question. So to summarize, content mining questions are really to have more in-depth information. The person has said something, and now we want them to follow up and explain or amplify or clarify, what they have said. Okay, now let me move on to some kind of basic general guidelines for doing a good interview. And some of this comes from research I've read, but also I think some of it comes from my own personal experience of doing a couple of projects that include interviews. Okay, so what's the first general rule? The first general rule is neutrality and avoiding self-disclosure. So you as an interviewer want to be neutral. You don't want to be biasing or affecting what the person's answers are, right? The interview is not about you. It's not about what you think or what about you believe, right? You, the interview, are irrelevant in a sense. The only thing we care about is the person being interviewed. And so we want their ideas, their beliefs. And so the most important thing is we don't want to bias the person's answers with our own information. Now that is complicated. The reason why it's complicated is that most conversations are a give and take. One person says something and then the other person says something and then the first person says something, right? Most conversations are back and forth, right? But the problem is if that starts to happen in an interview, then the back and forth will affect and influence what your interviewee says. And so basically you have to kind of avoid doing that. Really, in some sense, what you want to have happen is you want to talk very little. your interviewee should talk like 85, 90% of the time, and you should be talking like 10% of the time. It's not about you. That's a really important thing. So how do you more specifically, how do you remain neutral and avoid self-disclosure? So first off, you avoid asking leading questions, right? For the drug example, addiction to drugs, we could ask very leading questions about like, why do you use such terrible substances like heroin? Don't you know that it's bad for you? Right? No, that would be a terrible question to ask somebody. It leads them down. People are biased to giving the answers that they think that the other person wants to hear, right? But we don't want that. We want to know what the person actually thinks. And so we need to avoid asking them a leading question, a question that already presumes an answer. And so we want to ask kind of unbiased or objective questions, right? Questions just like, what do you think about heroin? Something like that, right? So we don't want the person to be able to guess what we think or what we know. Third, and this can sometimes be very hard, is we need to refrain from commenting on an answer, right? So it's a person says something surprising or shocking, I used heroin 30 minutes ago, right? That could surprise us, but we really can't react in that way, because our reaction can bias a person. We can't have expressions of moral indignation. We can't even hype the person up, like, we can't, we in some sense don't want to start talking about our feelings or our views. Again, it's about the person being interviewed. It's not about us. And so what you find in a practical sense is that a lot of times when a person says something, you will respond as the interviewer with things like this. Right? You will respond with sounds that shows that you're listening to the person, but doesn't really give a hint about what you think. Okay? And so that's important, right? You want to not bias the person. You want to know what they think honestly. You want to ask clear questions. This is actually easier said than done. You want to ask a question that a person can understand really quickly. They don't have to guess at what it means, but they can understand the question, and then they can answer, right? And they were really able to get at it. And so this is what I would say is the general guidelines for asking a good question, right? For doing a good interview, right? Make it clear. Don't bias your interviewee. Don't get them to answer in a certain way. Avoid leading questions, and be neutral. So far we've seen these kind of general guidelines, general ideas of how you do a qualitative interview. So we've seen the different types of interviews. We've seen the different types of questions. We've seen my guidelines for a good interview. Now, let me talk about an example of my own research in which I did an interview project. Okay, so the reading for this lesson was my article, Watching Bad Television, Ironic Consumption, Camp, and Guilty Pleasures. And it got turned into a Washington Post article, or Washington Post Online. And so that was kind of, interesting or good. And so now I can kind of ask, well, what was this research about? So let me begin by talking about, well, what was the research question? So really the research question was based on the general topic of popular culture, something that I'm interested in, right? Television, movies, magazines, computer games, the culture that we consume for entertainment. And one of the questions I had is from just, living in the world and talking to people is, sometimes people would describe the television that they themselves watched as trashy. right? Or terrible or bad or so awful, right? That I would talk to people, and I myself had this experience sometimes too, is, people would sometimes watch television that they thought was terrible. And so the question is, why would anybody do that, right? Why do people watch television shows that they themselves think are trashy? And so the important thing here to first talk about, or to first say, is when I call it, or me and my colleague called it, bad television, it's not that we are saying it's bad. It's not what that we're deciding that like Jersey Shore or Keeping Up with the Kardashians is bad television. No, what we're saying is the person themselves, the person watching, they say it's bad. And so we're not the ones saying it's trashy, it's the interviewees that are saying it's trashy. Again, this goes back to what I was just saying. It's not about what my feelings or my opinions matter. It's about what the interviewee thinks, right? And so this is what we wanted to find out. Why did people watch television that they themselves thought was morally and aesthetically bad or trashy? So what do? We did qualitative interviews. Me and my colleague, we did interviews with 40 people. So we, put out flyers. We put out envelopes inviting people to do this in the town where it was done. So you will notice that I can't say the town where it was done. It was done in a small to medium-sized town in the Mid-Atlantic. The reason why I can't say this is research ethics, right? That I have to keep my people who are interviewed, to keep their information confidential and anonymous. And so I can't even reveal where the study was done, since that might give a hint about who participated, right? But so we sent out invitations for people, and eventually we got around 40 people to talk to us. So I interviewed 20 people, and then my colleague interviewed 20 people. The interviews would take roughly about an hour, right? Sometimes 45 minutes. Sometimes people love to talk, and they would talk for like an hour and a half, 2 hours. So we would begin the interview by showing them about 10 minutes, 15 minutes of some television that we thought that they might think is trashy. We don't know. Sometimes they just liked it. Sometimes they thought it was trashy. So it was clips from the Jersey Shore reality TV show, and then clips from the TV show Desperate Housewives. So we showed them these clips, and then we started to interview them about their television watching habits. And so we said, okay, one of the first questions we asked them is, do you ever watch TV that you think is trashy, right? And they would say yes, they would say no, and we would say, well, what do you mean by trashy? Why do you think it's trashy? What do you think that word means? And so it was really about their television watching habits, and about what they think about TV, why they would sometimes watch TV that they didn't like. And so this got to be really interesting, and we interviewed a lot of people, and we found a lot of surprising things what people would say. So we found out that the people who would watch these shows that are trashy tended to be highly educated and have high incomes. And this kind of really surprised us. These were graduate students, these were law students, these were people who had high-paying, high-career jobs, and then they would go home at night and watch Jersey Shore. And so that that was a little bit surprising to us. So from all this, we created these different styles of watching bad TV, right, that you see in an article, right? So these different styles of watching TV really came from the interviews themselves. I didn't come in having these ideas or theories in mind, or these concepts in mind, but rather the concepts came from the data. And so it was really inductive, right? Inductive meaning it came from the data. The concepts were produced out of the data, rather than having concepts and then having some tests of it. So we came up with these different styles: ironic consumption, guilty pleasures, and camp sensibility. And it is the different ways that people are able to manage saying that something is trashy, but then still watching it. And you can read the article about, describing these different styles. And I think that the last thing to kind of end with is I think it shows how this type of research was able to produce in-depth research, right? To do this research, to find out why people watch trashy TV, I don't think it would have been possible to do a survey, right? It wouldn't have been possible to just ask people a list of questions and have them tick boxes, right? That would not have given the answers. We needed something more. We needed to really to have the person open up and to tell us what they thought, right? And so I think it's a good example of how you have to pick the right research method for the question that you want to find out. This question would not have been possible to answer with a survey or even content analysis. You really had to sit down with the people and ask them, what they thought, what they felt. And so I think it's a good example of getting the right research method for the right question. That is it for today. And hopefully that was useful.